The Meuse-Argonne Offensive, autumn 1918. The offensive that culminated in the armistice, the end of the war, and the German surrender. It's a pretty impressive story how the Americans and the French triumphed over some of the toughest ground on the Western Front, where the Allies had struggled to make an advance of any significance over the 4 years of the war so far. Before the offensive began, and during the offensive actually, massive victories were won right across the Western Front by the Allied forces, breaking through what was known as the Hindenburg Line. This line had been constructed by the Germans throughout late 1916 and into 1917, and it was a reinforcement of their position in France. The Battle of Verdun had massively weakened the German defences, not to mention the battle being a total failure for them, and the Battle of the Somme had forced the Germans to defend yet more of their front lines. The Hindenburg Line was built to hold back against those Allied attacks that the Germans knew would come in 1917 and onwards into 1918 with the introduction of American troops. Now, in April 1917, President Woodrow Wilson of the United States declared war against the Central Powers, despite the fact he'd been re-elected because he said he wouldn't go into the war. He instructed his army to make the trip across the Atlantic to back up and fight with the Allies on the Western Front. By 1918, considerable numbers of soldiers from the American Expeditionary Force had arrived in France, and many of them were fighting battles alongside the French, the British, and the Belgian soldiers there. The Meuse-Argonne Offensive commenced on September the 26th, 1918, and it combined American troops with the French army, and their objective was to launch an assault that would see the men fight their way through some of the most heavily fortified defences on the front lines. Now, some 600,000 men of the US First Army were committed to the attack along roughly a 20-mile stretch of line between the Meuse River on the eastern side and the Argonne Forest on the west. Along this 20-mile stretch, the Germans had set up a series of sublines, each of which was also heavily fortified. Barbed wire lay strewn everywhere between them, with machine gun nests, underground bunkers, and concrete pillboxes set up in strategic positions to give them the advantage over any incoming attack. The German soldiers defending the lines, however, were heavily depleted, with the war claiming more and more lives, leaving some divisions with less than 50% of its troops defending the sectors. Many soldiers were transported over from the Eastern Front, where the Germans had recently been assisting the Austro-Hungarians, who had suffered massive casualties during the Brusilov offensive. The American forces would fight alongside the French army in the assault, and French General Philippe Pétain was extremely apprehensive of the Americans' plans. Their first objective was to push through the dense forest and the surrounding area and capture the town of Meuse-Argonne, which was a few miles behind the German lines. Now, considering they needed to not only push through some of the most fortified positions on the Western Front, but also resist German counterattacks along the way, Pétain said the Americans would be lucky to even capture their first objective by the beginning of winter 1918. The Americans set up their advance with 9 divisions along the line and 5 reserve divisions, and the French with 5 divisions on the line and 7 in reserve. After a 3-hour artillery bombardment to break up the German barbed wire, at 5:30 a.m. on the 28th of September 1918, John J. Pershing of the American Expeditionary Force launched the attack. Quickly, the Americans broke through the front German defences and pushed further into enemy territory. The French army divisions also made significant gains on their first day, but both sets of troops were slowed down by the bad weather. Fog, torrential rain, and unstable ground were the main causes of the reduced push, but the Allied troops continued to push against the Germans and did make smaller gains all the way up till the end of September. After that initial push, and once the bad weather had set in, The Germans did push back a little bit and successfully counterattacked the Americans in certain sectors. On September the 29th, 6 further German divisions joined the defense and managed to push back the American 35th Division, by which time had run out of food and ammunition. The bad weather meant that artillery equipment and soldier supplies were slow to make it forward with the advancing troops, and soldiers were left with nothing to fight with. General Pershing, after this setback, said this: "We were no longer engaged in a manoeuvre for the pinching out of a salient, but were necessarily committed, generally speaking, to a direct frontal attack against strong, hostile positions fully manned by a determined enemy." As September ended and October started, American forces fighting in the Argonne Forest had captured between 2 and 5 miles of German-held ground, and the French nearly 9 miles. The French had been fighting on more open land, whereas the Americans had been restricted by the dense forest of trees. As the offensive moved into October, new objectives set by the American and French command continued to push against the German defences. All forces were constantly rotating their troops, but here, the American 1st Division pushed so far beyond the advancing line of troops that it caused a battalion of soldiers from the 77th Division to become surrounded by German soldiers. Now, this is what's known as the Lost Battalion, and of roughly 500 men who were trapped and being shelled by their own artillery, 197 of them were rescued by soldiers pushing up to plug the gap that the 1st Division had created. This was also the battle where Cher Ami, the famous messenger pigeon, delivered its message to tell the US forces to stop shelling the battalion's position. Another heroic act was written by Corporal Alvin York at this time of the American Expeditionary Force. On October the 8th, he and a group of soldiers were told to infiltrate the German defences and shut down a machine gun nest that had been pinning down a larger group of the Americans. Now, many of the group who travelled with Alvin York were injured in the attempt, but Alvin continued to fight and took down German after German as they advanced towards him. He eventually ran out of rifle ammunition, but continued to fight with only his pistol. The German soldier in charge of the machine gun nest also ran out of bullets whilst trying to kill him and offered to surrender. York accepted that surrender, and with the rest of the German soldiers still alive that they captured on their way to the machine gun point, he took 132 German soldiers as prisoners of war, and for his efforts, he was awarded the Medal of Honor. As the troops continued to push against the German lines, with numerical superiority and high morale after capturing so much ground, in September, the Americans finally broke clear of the Argonne Forest. In October, they'd advanced over 10 miles, and the French another 20 miles across open terrain, where they reached the Anya River. Moving into November, the Americans split into 2 armies and pushed in different directions. The Germans, now heavily depleted in supplies and numbers, fell faster than they had at any other point during the offensive, and they suffered the loss of Buzkani, allowing the French army to cross the River Anya and take Le Chesne. In the last few days before the German surrender, the French actually captured the objective of the entire offensive, the commune of Sedan, and its railroad hub that the Germans had been using to supply their troops, and the Americans surrounded that commune and captured the vantage points in the hills. On November the 11th, news reached the front lines that the Germans had surrendered, and the fighting stopped almost immediately. In total, over 1.25 million American soldiers fought in the offensive to push back the Germans in some of their most protected land. And just as the German resistance was starting to crumble, they surrendered to end the fighting. The Meuse-Argonne Offensive was the deadliest battle in US history, however, with over 26,000 soldiers dying in the attacks. Now, overall, the 100 Days Offensive, the name given to all of the battles fought by the Allies at the end of World War I, is credited to be the reason the Germans surrendered. British, French and Belgian forces fighting in the north, and the French-American advances in the Argonne. Thanks very much for watching. I hope you learned something today. I certainly did, because it took me a long time to research all of this stuff and condense it down into just a 10-minute video. If you did enjoy the video and you want to see me make more of these kind of videos on historical battles or very important moments during World War I, leave a like on today's video and let me know with a comment down below in the comments section. Again, thank you very much for watching, and until next time, my name is Westie, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.